What do you want? What's so funny?
That's what the other guy said. The guy who was driving that car back there. The guy who picked me up before you did. Couldn't have walked very far because I cut off his legs and his arm and his head. And I'm gonna do the same to you.
It's 4:15 on a Saturday morning.
My mother told me never to do this. So you want me to drop you off somewhere? You gonna tell me where you're going? What are you looking at me like that for?
You wanna know what happens to an eyeball when it gets punctured?
What do you want?
I want you to stop me.
You got the knife. You'll stick me with it before I can do anything.
That's right. So what have you got to lose? Stop me.
I don't want to die! Close! Please, I need to use a phone. Hello, police? This morning, this guy tried to kill me. He's been following me ever since.
Stand where you are! Put your hands in the air, get down on the ground!
Wait a minute, he's in there! Do I look like a killer to you? Why are you doing this to me?
You're a smart kid. Figure it out.
Who is he?
We don't know. No prison record, no driver's license, no birth certificate.
Hi, kid.
The Hitcher hit the big screen in late February of 1986 in the USA and made its way to the UK in May of that year. Directed by Robert Harmon, who had only directed a short back in 1983 called China Lake. He would later go on to direct the Van Damme action movie Nowhere to Run. His career would later focus on the direct-to-TV movies such as Jesse Stone, starring Tom Selleck. The Hitcher would fail at the box office, with it only recouping its budget back. Its international figures remain unknown, with it being distributed by Cannon Films in some territories. Ultimately, it was deemed a failure. What played a part in the film's poor performance was down to its harsh reviews from the critics. The Washington Post said the script was dull, and Harmon and his cinematographer John Seale have shot the movie in such brown murk you can hardly make anything out. Variety called it a highly unimaginative slasher, with a script that has many holes. On the show At the Movies, Roger Ebert hated it and gave it a thumbs down. He said it was technically well made, but said it was perverted, heartless and cruel. Gene Siskel also gave it a thumbs down. He hated how Nash, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, was killed. He calls out Silver Screen Pictures as a tax-sheltered deal, and TriStar, who distributed it in the USA, having been taken for a ride, having garbage like The Hitcher being released on the big screen. Roger also highlighted the love interest in the movie is between Jim Halsey, played by C. Thomas Howell, and John Ryder, played by Rutger Hauer, though the movie is not honest about it, playing this violent game as some sort of perverted sex. For the Globe and Mail, the film was described as a slasher movie about gay panic and a nasty piece of homophobic angst for the age of AIDS. Leonard Maltin awarded the film a score of 2.5 out of 4 stars, criticising the film's violence as being genuinely grisly and unappealing, while also noting that the film wasn't without interest. One of the film's producers said that the film's commercial failure was because of the lack of violence, and that Nash's death should have been shown, saying, "You can't show all the killings we showed and then not show the main one. It's cheating the audience." Rutger Hauer said critics misunderstood the film. According to him, it is an allegory in which Ryder represents evil. Despite its poor box office results, it would become a hit on home video and later become a cult classic, which resulted in a direct-to-DVD sequel 17 years later called Hitcher 2: I've Been Waiting. The long wait for a sequel took so long due to the rights to the material being passed back and forth between several hands over the years. C. Thomas Howell returns as Jim Halsey, who works as a police officer and is suffering from PTSD due to his run-in with Ryder years back, and keeps getting flashbacks to those horrible events. Jim and his girlfriend Maggie go on a trip and encounter the new Hitcher played by Jake Busey, who starts to terrorise them, with the story shifting to focus on Maggie. Critics gave it pretty low scores, citing weak production values and the contrivance of the killer being a second hitchhiking maniac with no connection to the one from the first film. I didn't think it was awful. It has some good cinematography in places, and performances are okay, with Jake Busey hamming it up in places, making his performance humorous and not scary, but ultimately it was very average and a bit boring. The film plays more on the horror aspects and is less effective as a psychological thriller, and doesn't do a good job in the horror department either. A few years later, Michael Bay got his hands on it and decided it was time for a remake, as he loved the original 80s film, and suggested having a female protagonist. Obviously he didn't see the sequel. Sean Bean becomes the Hitcher, and it basically follows the plot of the original. As soon as the film starts with its cheesy pop rock music introducing the leads, I already wanted them to be killed off as soon as possible. With the film being a remake, it repeats a lot of the scenes from the original, and weirdly takes on a familiar look to the direct-to-DVD sequel, with this warm look throughout for the daytime scenes with the colours being oversaturated, a typical look for Bay's productions. Sean Bean has been consistently good with his performances over the years, but he lacks the somewhat charm of Rutger Hauer's take on the role, where he had a bit more of a cheeky smile to everything he did, like it was a bit of fun. Bean plays him as a massive arsehole. The main leads are unlikable, and the thriller aspect of the original is gone, replacing it for cheap shocks and gratuitous violence. The reviews were pretty harsh. Empire awarded it 2 stars, and the New York Post nicely called it the Jessica Simpson of psycho killer flicks, cheerful in touch with its own brainlessness. I didn't enjoy watching this film at all. It was an utter turd and a waste of everyone's time and money making it. The writer of The Hitcher, Eric Red, who would go on to write the horror classic Near Dark, made a short film called Gunman's Blues back when he was 20 years old, in the hopes of getting the opportunity to direct a feature-length film. When he had no luck getting any work, he moved from New York to Austin, Texas, and travelled by taking a drive-away car cross-country. While driving from one city to another, he got the idea for a film from the Doors' song Riders on the Storm. He found that the elements of the song A Killer on the Road in a Storm, plus the cinematic feel of the music, would make a terrific opening for a film, and this idea stuck with him. Eric needed work and quickly found a job driving a taxi cab. During this time he encountered one customer who spooked him out, and this helped him develop the script. The Hitcher script ended up being 190 pages long. In 1983 he sent a letter to several Hollywood producers asking if he could send them a copy of the screenplay for The Hitcher. His letter concluded, "It grabs you by the guts and does not let up, and it does not let go. When you read it, you will not sleep for a week." Script development executive David Bumiak received a copy of Red's letter and was intrigued by the description of the film. The violence in the original script was very graphic, where an entire family is slaughtered in their station wagon, an eyeball is discovered inside a hamburger, and a woman is tied to a truck and a pole and then torn in half. It was seen as too brutal and gory, and it was labelled as an exploitation film, but others who got a chance to read it felt differently, saying it had a level of challenge, intensity and poetry to it. Producer Charles Meeker, who would go on to produce Near Dark and write and produce the direct-to-DVD sequel of Hitcher, and Edward Feldman, who worked on Witness and The Truman Show, both showed an interest in producing The Hitcher. To get things moving forward, they first needed an inexpensive director on board. Stills photographer turned cameraman Robert Harmon was given a copy of the script by his agent and called his agent early next morning, telling him that he wanted to do it. In February of 1984, Harmon met the producers to talk about the script and envisioned the film as a Hitchcockian thriller, which impressed them. The script was shopped around to a number of studios, Orion Pictures, New World Pictures, Warner Brothers and Universal, who all turned it down. Many executives liked the script, but citing the violence was an issue, so over the next 6 months, the script was reworked, removing most of the repetitive violence. Once they got it in a good shape, it was taken to 20th Century Fox. The studio executive, David Madden, thought it was terrific, but the studio was not comfortable with the subject matter, but felt that the writing was unique and interesting enough to give the filmmakers a letter of intent to distribute the film. This would allow them to get financing, and then once filming was completed, the studio would reimburse them for the budget. Fox ultimately rejected the project over the budget and saw it as a straight-out horror movie. Some people at the studio thought it was pretty gross. David Madden also admitted that he would have argued to soften the movie, but the producers didn't want to keep making changes. Independent producer Donna Dubrow, who worked for Silver Screen Partners and HBO, heard about The Hitcher, and to her it sounded like Duel with a person. She got hold of the script and submitted it to her boss, HBO Senior Vice President Maurice Singer. He liked it, but it needed the approval of their chairman Michael Fuchs. Michael would take some convincing, as he didn't like this type of material and didn't want to make it. Donna managed to convince him and pitched it as a Hitchcock-style thriller. Fuchs agreed to make the film, but with the stipulation that the girl would not be torn apart and the violence be toned down. Over the next few months, the filmmakers negotiated 2 key scenes in the script, the girl getting ripped apart of course, and the eyeball in the hamburger. For the later scene, Harmon just changed a body part to a finger. Fuchs did not want the girl to die, and Dubrow argued that this would change the story significantly. There were arguments about how the girl should die, and Dubrow remembers they were trying to make her death not horrible, when by the nature of the script it had to be. The studio even suggested softening her death scene by having a funeral. The filmmakers refused to back down, and Silver Screen executives finally relented at the last minute. But her death happens off screen, so any graphic visuals of her dying is removed. Rutger Hauer plays John Ryder, aka the Hitcher. A number of actors were considered for the part in early drafts of the script. John Ryder had been described as skeletal in nature, and so actors like David Bowie, Sting, Harry Dean Stanton, and one actor that Robert Harmon wanted was Terence Stamp. Robert was set on casting Stamp and even carried around his picture to meetings, but once Stamp read the script he turned the role down. Dutch actor Rutger Hauer was suggested. While in LA for a short visit, Hauer read the script. Even though he was looking for a non-villainous role, he said the script really got hold of him. If he was to play one more villain, he should do this. He couldn't refuse it. C. Thomas Howell plays Jim Halsey. Like the role of John Ryder, many actors were considered and approached to play Jim, such as Matthew Modine, Tom Cruise and Emilio Estevez. They settled on Howell and liked his look. At the time he was being more selective with his roles, having rose to fame with his role in E.T., and he would later go on to star in The Outsiders and Red Dawn. Harmon personally gave Howell a copy of the script. He could not put it down and couldn't believe the things that happened to his character in the first 12 pages. He knew he wanted to do it. Unbeknownst to Rutger Hauer, Howell found him frightening and intimidating, and that he was in a constant state of fear, almost as if he really was John Ryder. Jennifer Jason Leigh was cast as Nash. Jennifer agreed to do the film because she wanted to work with Hauer again, having worked with him on Paul Verhoeven's film Flesh and Blood. The always reliable Jeffrey DeMunn plays Captain Esteridge, who appears to be the only officer who comes to understand Jim and tries to reason with him not to get involved once Ryder is captured and escapes. Jeffrey is a star of TV and film, appearing in classics such as the remake of The Blob and The Green Mile. A familiar face of TV, we have Billy Greenbush as Trooper Donner, who strongly believes Jim is behind these gruesome deaths. Billy appeared in some horror films in the 80s and 90s with Critters and Jason Goes to Hell. The film opens across the Badlands of Texas at the dead of night. Jim Halsey is delivering a car from Chicago to San Diego, and in the rain he spots a man hitchhiking and decides to give him a ride. The brooding, sneezing hitchhiker calls himself John Ryder. Conversation is short and awkward between them. Jim spots a stranded car along the road, and John forces Jim's leg down on the accelerator. Ryder states he murdered the driver and intends to do the same to Jim, threatening him with a switchblade and wants Jim to fight back. With Jim realising that Ryder's seatbelt is unbuckled and the passenger door is ajar, he shoves Ryder out of the moving car. Jim is relieved, but his nightmare has just started. A terrifying cat-and-mouse game soon develops between Halsey and Ryder, with the Hitcher taunting his unwilling protege. When Jim shows his reluctance to take part, Ryder wipes out anyone capable of helping the teenager. As Jim tries to evade Ryder, he meets waitress Nash, who seems to be the only one who believes him. Jim finds himself being blamed for Ryder's actions, with the police surrounding the restaurant. Jim winds up in jail but awakens later to find his jail cell open, and all the officers at the station are dead. He grabs a gun and flees, knowing that Ryder is closing in. Mark Isham would compose the score to The Hitcher. Mark would later go on to compose the score to Robert Harmon's film Nowhere to Run, and would work on another Van Damme film, Time Cop. Mark insisted on seeing the film before he committed to the project, and remained uncertain after viewing a 3-hour rough cut. Robert encouraged him to see beyond the violence and fears of tackling the film, and gave Mark the opportunity to express himself through the music, as the composer found horror a turn-off, especially after one of the executives called him up humming the Jaws theme and asked for a similar theme of terror. Mark referred back to his Brian Eno influences in creating the score. Mark wouldn't have the music time with the visuals in the traditional way. His approach was to a more state of mind, but was encouraged to go back to scenes and add exact stings of music to serve the gun blasts and tire screeches. I was really impressed with the score. The 1980s with features with lower budgets opted for synthesized scores, and Mark's moody atmospheric approach really fits the movie. The score isn't just electronic and incorporates some orchestral moments, in particular for the opening sequence, which blends well with the electronic compositions. Surprisingly, the end credits is my favourite piece of the score, just this somber moment of reflection for the character of Jim, and the music just fits the mood so well. The style of the score is very similar to what John Carpenter and Alan Howarth were doing around this same time, which is not a bad thing. The soundtrack didn't come out back in 1986, but it made its way to CD in 1992, which was about 43 minutes in length, and was reissued in 2021, so it's still available to get hold of. The master tapes to the score have been lost over time, so the soundtrack makes use of Mark's original beta masters, and there are moments in some of the tracks where you can tell it's not in the best condition, with the high frequencies sounding a tad distorted, but it's still worth getting hold of, as it's a fantastic score, and if you love some synth music, it's a must. I had never seen The Hitcher until fairly recently, which may come as a surprise to some. As a kid, I always saw it on the shelves at my local VHS rental store. I didn't really know much about Rutger Hauer, and with the film being rated an 18, it was certainly out of my reach. I became aware of Rutger's work in the later part of my teens, as I fell in love with Blade Runner and the dark retrofitted world of the future, accompanied by one of the greatest scores of that decade. Rutger's career didn't really take off for him to be regarded as an A-lister in the industry, but he was always working and found himself as the lead in many lower budget action movies, with all of them being aimed at an older audience. I think Ladyhawke was probably one of the fewer movies he did that was aimed at a general audience. So after finally watching The Hitcher, what can I say about it? Well, I thought it was a really good film, and I really disagreed with a lot of what the critics said at the time. Sure, you have to remember attitudes were different, and also this is over 30 years later I'm watching it with a fresh pair of eyes, but the constant complaints of its violence made me laugh, because there isn't much in the film to really shock you. Robert Harmon cleverly suggests what happens to Ryder's victims, but you never see it. It's smart direction to let one's imagination fill in the gaps as you watch Jim react to the horrors of what Ryder has done. I'm sure many of a younger age who watched it and freaked out when Jim found a finger in his fries, which is funny and gross at the same time. How the film played out, I had no idea how the story would unfold, or had an idea how it would end. Many times you can sit there watching a film and you kind of know how things are going to play out. Maybe not to the finest detail, of course, but The Hitcher I felt was really unpredictable, which made it very suspenseful and thrilling to watch. As soon as the film starts, it looks incredible. The photography throughout by John Searle, who also worked on The Witness and later The English Patient and Mad Max Fury Road, brings a high level of quality to the film. With director Robert Harmon being a skilled photographer, you have two talents behind the camera to take a B movie budget to the level of an A movie. Shot on anamorphic lenses, it has a great depth to the visuals and captures the barren landscapes with style. And with the action, it's tightly edited and well executed with fantastic scope, especially with Jim's escape from the petrol station that is about to explode. I cannot fault the film at all in the visuals department. It really does look stunning, and with the upcoming 4K release from Second Sight, I imagine it will be a must-own title. There's definitely some confusion about what type of genre The Hitcher is. Some say it's a horror, despite some of those involved in making the film disagreeing and others feeling strongly it's a psychological thriller. I would say it's a mix of the two, leaning more towards the thriller aspects. You can see the obvious comparisons to Steven Spielberg's TV movie Duel, with a guy being chased and terrorised by an unseen driver, but also The Hitcher borrows ideas from The Terminator, with it being a big hit 2 years earlier and was very influential on the home video market during the later part of the 80s and into the 90s. The way Ryder just relentlessly chases Jim and plays with him, wanting Jim to fight back. We have Ryder just seemingly popping up out of nowhere, like he is a ghost avoiding detection. I suppose you could argue that it has plot holes in regards to how Ryder gets around. He seems to go about his business unseen and turns up quickly to spook Jim. With Rutger Hauer returning to play a villain, and one that is totally mysterious and extremely violent, reading back through the old reviews, you can understand some of the frustration that comes with his character. There's no backstory given, so you don't understand his motives or get to know his character, other than he is pure evil, and likes to play games in which to encourage Jim to attack him, having a sense that he wants Jim to become like him, a killer who has no remorse and does it for fun. Jim's only friendship comes from meeting the waitress Nash. This relationship doesn't really go anywhere. You kind of expect them to get closer, as she sticks with him, ignoring her job and her father's advice to come home. Once at the hotel where Jim and Nash recharge, Ryder again has found them as he crawls into bed and touches her, with her believing it's Jim. Then he takes her away and ties her up to be pulled apart, and by this point the cops have arrived and finally believe Jim and his story, but he is put into a position where he has to cross the line but struggles to make the next move, which results in Nash being killed. Left with that depression, he begins to become who Ryder wants him to be, which results in a great finale. The Hitcher is a cult classic in a traditional sense, something that was trashed by the critics who didn't appreciate it at the time, and it fortunately found its audience who understood and appreciated its qualities on home video and TV, thus encouraged a sequel years later and a remake, so there was still value in just the film's name alone. As we all know, movies that don't hit well with critics on release, in the case of The Thing and Blade Runner, which are classic examples of how films failed at the time, become important years later. The Hitcher is not to that level of quality, but it demonstrates that some movies either go under the radar due to bad marketing, or critics fail to understand what the film was attempting to do and see it differently, and as a result bash it and write it off, and it can seem baffling years later, or even at the time for some, why things didn't work out. The Hitcher could seem like trash or throwaway B-movie fodder at face value, but it's a well thought out, executed action thriller with a slice of horror that manages to tick the right boxes to produce a fine balance of genres, and it probably made people think twice before picking up randoms on the street. Rutger Hauer shows that he can play a villain effortlessly, and it also showed us that Robert Harmon, who had little experience as a director, could easily compete with the big directors of Hollywood. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button and click the bell to be notified of my latest retrospectives and reviews. Big thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel. If you want to get involved and gain early access to my content and exclusive videos, then follow the link below.